Chapter 6. Will stared at the words on the paper in utter confusion. His first reaction was one of relief. He wasn't to be condemned to a lifetime of farm work, and he wasn't to be punished for his actions in the Baron's study. Then that initial sense of relief gave way to a sudden nagging doubt. He knew nothing about the Rangers, beyond myth and superstition. He knew nothing about Halt, apart from the fact that the grim, gray-cloaked figure had made him feel nervous whenever he was around. Now it seemed he was being assigned to spend all his time with him, and he wasn't sure that he liked the idea at all. He looked up at the two men. The Baron, he could see, was smiling expectantly. Apparently he felt that Will should greet his decision as good news. He couldn't see Halt's face clearly. The deep cowl of his cloak left his face in shadow. The Baron's smile faded slightly. He appeared a little puzzled by Will's reaction to the news. Or rather, his lack of any visible reaction. "Well, what do you say, Will?" he asked in an encouraging tone. Will drew a deep breath. "Thank you, sir, my lord," he said uncertainly. What if the Baron's earlier joke about the note containing his punishment was more serious than he thought? Maybe being assigned to be Halt's apprentice was the worst punishment he could have chosen. But the Baron certainly didn't look as if he thought so. He seemed to be very pleased with the idea, and Will knew he wasn't an unkind man. The Baron gave a little sigh of pleasure as he lowered himself into an armchair. He looked up at the Ranger and gestured toward the door. "Perhaps you might give us a few moments alone, Halt. I'd like to have a word with Will in private," he said. The Ranger bowed gravely. "Certainly, my lord," he said, the voice coming from deep inside the cowl. He moved, silently as ever, past Will and out through the door that led to the corridor outside. The door closed behind him with barely a sound, and Will shivered. The man was uncanny. "Sit down, Will." The Baron gestured to one of the low armchairs facing his own. Will sat nervously on the edge of it, as if poised for flight. The Baron noted his body language and sighed. "You don't seem very pleased with my decision," he said, sounding disappointed. The reaction puzzled Will. He wouldn't have thought a powerful figure like the Baron would care one way or another what an insignificant ward would think about his decisions. He didn't know how to answer, so he sat in silence until finally the Baron continued. "Would you prefer to work as a farmhand?" he asked. He couldn't believe that a lively, energetic boy like this could possibly prefer such a dull, uneventful life. But maybe he was wrong. Will hurriedly reassured him on that score. "No, sir," he said hastily. The Baron made a small, questioning gesture with his hands. "Well then, would you prefer that I punished you somehow for what you've done?" Will started to speak, then realized that his answer might be insulting and stopped. The Baron gestured for him to continue. "It's just that I'm not sure you haven't, sir," he said. Then, noticing the frown that creased the Baron's forehead as he said the words, he hurried on. I don't know much about Rangers, sir, and people say—" He let the words trail off. It was obvious that the Baron held Halt in some esteem, and Will didn't think it was yeah. There's another word that one was reminded me of, but that isn't the word they wrote. Politic, for him to point out that ordinary people feared Rangers and thought they were warlocks. He saw that the Baron was nodding, and a look of understanding had replaced the perplexed expression he had been wearing. "Of course. People say they're black magicians, don't they?" he agreed, and Will nodded, not even realizing he was doing so. "Tell me, Will, Do you find Halt to be a frightening person?" "No, sir," Will said hastily. Then, as the Baron held his gaze, he reluctantly added, "Well, maybe a bit." The Baron leaned back, steepling his fingers together. Now that he understood the reasons for the boy's reluctance, he berated himself mentally for not foreseeing them. After all, he had a better knowledge of the Ranger Corps than he could expect of a young boy just turned 15, who was subjected to the usual superstitious mutterings of the castle staff. "The Rangers are a mysterious group of people," he said, "but there's nothing about them to be frightened of, unless you're an enemy of the kingdom." He could see that the boy was hanging on his every word, and he added jokingly, "You're not an enemy of the kingdom, are you, Will?" "No, sir," Will said in sudden fright, and the Baron sighed again. He hated it when people didn't realize he was joking. Unfortunately, as overlord of the castle, his words were treated with great seriousness by most people. All right, he said reassuringly. "I know you're not. But believe me, I thought you'd be glad of this appointment. An adventurous lad like you should take to life as a ranger like a duck to water. It's a big opportunity for you, Will." He paused, studying the boy closely, seeing that he was still uncertain about the whole matter. Very few boys are chosen to be apprentice rangers, you know. The opportunity only comes up on rare occasions. Will nodded, but he still wasn't totally convinced. He thought he owed it to his dream to have one last attempt at battle school. After all, the Baron did seem to be in an uncommonly good mood this evening, in spite of the fact that Will had broken into his office. "I wanted to be a warrior, sir," he said tentatively, but the Baron shook his head immediately. "I'm afraid your talents lie in other directions. Halt knew that when he first saw you. That's why he asked for you." "Oh," said Will. There wasn't much else he could say. He felt he should be reassured by all that the Baron had said, and to a certain degree he was. But there was still so much uncertainty to it all, he thought. "It's just that Halt seems to be so grim all the time," he said. "He certainly doesn't have my sparkling sense of humor," the Baron agreed. Then, as Will looked blankly at him, he muttered something under his breath. Will wasn't sure what he'd done to upset him, so he thought it best to change the subject. "But what does a ranger actually do, my lord?" he asked. Once again, the Baron shook his head. "That's for Halt to tell you himself. They're a quirky group, and they don't like other people talking about them too much. Now, perhaps you should go back to your quarters and try to get some sleep. You're to report to Halt's cottage at 6 o'clock in the morning." "Yes, my lord," Will said, rising from his uncomfortable perch on the edge of the chair. He wasn't sure if he was going to enjoy life as a ranger's apprentice, but it appeared he had no choice in the matter. He bowed to the Baron, who nodded briefly in return. Then he turned away for the door. The Baron's voice stopped him. "Will, this time, use the stairs." "Yes, my lord," he replied seriously, and was a little puzzled by the way the Baron rolled his eyes to the sky and muttered to himself again. This time he could make out a few words. It was something about jokes, he thought. He let himself out through the door. The sentries were still on duty on the landing by the stairs, but Halt was gone, or at least he appeared to be. With the ranger, you could never be quite certain. That chapter 6 is a pretty short chapter, less than 10 minutes. So I'll get right on to doing chapter 7. So if you want to keep going, you can.